Hello guys, this is Panzer 36, and in today's video we're going to be looking at adding some basic detail upgrades to this Panzer III. Most kits nowadays are missing a few of these little details which can really augment the look of the model. So in this video we're going to look at adding the conduit wires for the headlights. We're going to look at upgrading all the tool clamps with 3D printed and photo etched accessories to make them look nice and in scale. And lastly, we're going to scratch build a stowage rack on the rear of the vehicle, and also look at adding the stowage itself to give it that Africa core look. So as always, sit back, enjoy, and let's look at upgrading this Panzer III. So here's the subject of this video. This is a Dragon Panzer IIIL, and it's a pretty nice kit. I love Dragon Panzer IIIs. They're always fun to build, but you know, they're a little out of date now. The tool clamps are a little bit chunky, and there's no conduits included for the headlights at all, which is something that these vehicles did have for sure. And as an Africa core vehicle, we really should have a bunch of stowage on the engine deck as well. Let's start with the conduit wires. For these I'm going to use Plastruct 0.01 inch styrene rod. I've also used the 0.015 inch, which works just the same way. I find that this is the right diameter where you can easily bend the rod without it breaking, and it will also hold its shape. You don't need to use heat or anything. It just will bend and stay as it is. As you can see, I'm just doing it completely by, just kind of eye here. I'm not really measuring it. I'm just placing it and then grabbing the next spot for the bend with the tweezers and so on. And there's a few specific bends you have to make here as it comes out of the light, then goes down and then angles forward along the hull, and then you have to give it a 45-degree bend here to actually meet up with the light. Now you can also use the brass rod or copper rod technique here as well, which is probably easier, but I like the plastic rod because it is very easy to tack in place, and you can also easily trim off any excess with a knife. I also add a little bit here for the siren, just a little connector onto the conduit as well. And there we go, very easy, just a few minutes work, and this definitely augments the look of the model. Some kits give you these parts, but most don't these days. Alright, next up, let's look at improving the tool clamp detail on this model. The Dragon kits come with the molded on clamps, which are okay, but they're not up to my level of detail I like now. So I simply hack them off, and then I sand down the clamp so it just becomes part of the shaft of the shovel in this case. Now looking at the shovel here, you can see that it's actually very thick, so we're going to quickly thin down the actual blade here so it looks more in scale. You can see on the one side there, on the right side, it looks much thinner than on the left. And when both sides are done, this is the result. That looks much better. Alright, now let's actually look at the clamp. So I'm going to use these MJ Miniatures Type 1 and Type 2 tool clamps. And looking at reference pictures of the vehicle, I need to use entirely Type 1 clamps. These are 3D printed, and they're not the most recent set, so there actually are some layer lines on them, which most sets don't have these days. But they're very fine, and I simply scrape them off with a knife. To remove the part from the build plate, I first cut off the supports under the handle because it's the most fragile part, and then I remove the supports under the main body of the clamp. There we go. I'm going to use some risers from this Alliance Model Works photo etch set. I don't really use the clamps from it anymore, I just use the risers because that's a quite iconic feature of most of these clamps. They are actually lifted off the vehicle to have the right angle based on the shovel or crowbar or whatever. Next, I mark the location where I need to cut the shaft of the tool to put the clamp in the right spot. I slide it into place, and then I take some Tamiya extra thin cement and I will glue the shaft back together. I just slide the clamp back up over it, and that covers it up. Now we super glue it in place, and that looks much better than the molded on plastic blob. On most tools, you don't actually have to cut them, you can just slide the clamps on, but the shovel had a big knob at the end, so that's why I had to cut the shovel. On some tools you have holding devices, as you can see at the end of the wire cutters here for the knobs. So for those, I'm going to just use a random spare photo etch set I have lying around, which has the right part. A theme in this video is going to be I'm just grabbing random bits and bobs lying around because there's endless 3D printed and photo etch sets for tool clamps, and they're all pretty much interchangeable. Here's a 3D printed fire extinguisher, which I think are excellent details. It's much better than cleaning up the seam lines on a molded plastic one. And of course, you also get the empty option as we see here. I'm going to use this excellent model cast-in set, which is actually plastic, not resin, and I'm going to use that for the cable clamps. These are multi-part assemblies that go together, and they're actually posable, so you can have them open if you want to, as I'm doing here, have them empty. And a little wing nut adds a nice touch. Alright, I've got an Elephant Corporation 3D printed set here, which has the little holders for the cable. These are little C-shaped guys, which is the cable is wrapped through. So these are very fine details, which you could also make out of photo etch, but this is much easier. Alright, now an FC Model Trend set of 3D printed tool clamps. FC Model Trend stuff isn't usually that great, but this set's okay. And I'm using it only for the cleaning rod clamps, which are specific to this version of the Panzer III, which is an N with a short 75. Now here is the plastic jack block included in the kit, which has nice wood grain texture on the top, but not on the sides. So I'm going to carve it in with my hobby blade here. I do linear grain on the sides, and actually at the ends I will carve an arch shaped, like it's the cross section of the piece of wood. Not sure how legit that is, but it always looks really good, especially when the model's painted and we hit it with a wash to accentuate that wood grain. And a simple strap with some spare photo etch looks really, really good. So you can see here we've upgraded most of the tool clamps in the vehicle, with the exception being the jack, because it was already on the model when I started here and I built this years ago. But if I were to choose next time, I'm going to use these Roshem 3D printed jacks because they look absolutely incredible. It's amazing the level of detail you can get on a 3D print. There's even little handles and like plaques, like safety markings on these things. It's insane. Alright, so here let's take a look at all the tool clamps in the vehicle. I really like the 3D printed clamps because they're much easier to put together than photo etch, because you just cut them off the base plate. And I like the option of having empty tool clamps in the vehicle. It adds some interest, and you can kind of move the tools around as you frequently see in photographs. Alright, so my tank here is a tank from North Africa, and it's very iconic to have a lot of stowage in the back. So I'm going to scratch build a stowage rack using random bits of photo etch fret. This is just strips cut out from the leftover fret material from various kits over the past 10 years. I've just collected. Any long uninterrupted strip here is perfect. You can also buy strip, but this stuff is free, of course. It's just garbage. So I make some little marks where I want to bend it, and I simply use my tweezers and my fingers, much like at the beginning with the conduit wires. And I'm actually going to super glue this together because I'm really bad at soldering, but if you can solder, it's much stronger and preferred to solder photo etch assemblies. So I came up with this whole shape based on my reference photo, but there's plenty of variety with these things because at this point in the war, these were put together by the work crews, not done at the factory professionally. In the photo here, you can see a bunch of wood planks on the back to provide the brace for the stowage. So let's make that wood plank now. I've just got a random piece of thin styrene sheet here, cut it out, and we're going to carve in the wood grain texture with my knife as usual. And once it's looking alright, we will then chop it into the individual boards, and then I glue them in place. The way you cut them and then glue them back together makes it look more defined, but I guess you could just scribe them really deeply. But this just looked really, really good, so I cut it apart and then glued it back together. And now I piled on a bunch of stowage, again looking at the reference photo for placement. This is trial and error with a bunch of boxes and jerry cans and everything I've got in my spares bin. These are resin, plastic, 3D printed. I think the box there is plaster, one of them. And it's a bunch of trial and error. Just keep moving things around until you get something that looks convincing. And you can see value gear. This is War Front. These are TMD jerry cans. The final touch will be to apply some tarps over our stowage. And for this I'm going to use the VMS Paper Shaper system. I've never used this before, so this is my first time, trial and error. The VMS set comes with some really thin paper which works well with their fluid. As you can see here, I first just kind of pressed it into the paper shaper fluid, let it sit for a few minutes, and then pulled it out. And this didn't quite work because the paper was very rigid and didn't want to conform, as you can see here. Rather, it would just flop back and forth as I try to get it to bend over the boxes. I discovered that the key to this technique is to actually crumple up the paper as you push it into the fluid. That makes the paper much softer and it ends up being much more flexible when you try to get it to conform over the model. So if you do give the VMS stuff a try, make sure you crumple up that paper as you soak it in the fluid. And that way it looks nice and behaves properly. I also experimented with some rolling and folding to make bed sheets, and it all worked out very well. And you have a long working time, I'd say maybe 2 hours, and you can keep modifying it with a wet brush with the paper shaper fluid. And when it was in a nice place, I then hit it with a hair dryer, and that dried it up and locked it in. So for my first ever serious attempt at stowage, I think this came out looking really nice. The wood planks look excellent, and all the stowage arrangement plus the tarps and everything just has a very Africa core look to it. So you can see in this video, it was not too much effort to add the extra detail with the 3D printed tool clamps and the conduit wires and all that stuff. You don't have to do all of it, you can just add the conduit wires and leave them molded on clamps, but a lot of people have these 3D printed accessories now and they're asking me how to make use of them. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the comment section below because I always read through them all. And if you like the video, I would appreciate you guys giving it a like and subscribing if you want to see more. Additionally, if you really like my content, you can support me on Patreon with the link on screen now. That really helps me buying these products to review and show in these videos for you guys. As always, I'll see you guys next time. Until then, stay safe, goodbye, and happy modeling.